They took my name off the will. They smiled while they did it. My mother called it a formality. My father called it fairness, 11 years. Mortgage payments, medical bills, late notices with my name in the return address. And they folded all of it into one sentence. You were only ever our backup plan. My brother didn't even look up from his phone. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I signed where the lawyer pointed. My hand stayed in my coat pocket the whole time, on an envelope my grandfather gave me before he died. It was sealed. 4 words on the front. Keep this until asked. 2 weeks later, a different lawyer would break a different seal. My mother's face would come apart like wet paper. But before any of that, there was a folding table, 11 years of receipts in a shoebox, and a family that never once checked whose name was actually on the deed. Let me take you back. Back to the Tuesday my grandfather's estate got read. That's where this really starts. My name is Dana Foley. I'm 33. I keep the books for the Marshalltown Grain and Feed Co-op, out past the elevator on Route 14. I've kept books my whole life. My parents' books too, whether they asked me to or not. I did not scream. I did not beg. I sat in a folding chair in Walter Henley's office, a grey Tuesday in March. My mother on one side, my father on the other. My brother Cole a row back, checking his phone. I listened to a lawyer read my name out of a will like he was crossing an item off a grocery list. To my daughter Sharon and her husband Garrett, Henley read, I leave the remainder of my estate in trust. He turned a page. There is no further disposition specified for grandchildren. My mother touched my knee, like she was consoling me over a parking ticket. Oh, sweetheart, she said, smiling the smile she saved for strangers, the one with no teeth in it. You were only ever our backup plan. I didn't say anything. I looked at Henley instead. Henley didn't look back at me. I understood that later. At the time, it just felt strange. Let me tell you where this actually starts. None of it makes sense unless you know how long I'd been the one holding things up. My grandfather, Earl Mercer, owned 310 acres out past the co-op on Deer Creek Road, a 2-story farmhouse with a wraparound porch he built himself back in 1974, a savings account at Marshalltown Savings and Loan he never once mentioned at dinner. He was my mother's father, and he was the only person in my family who ever asked how I was doing and actually waited for the answer. He died in February, peacefully, in his sleep, in the back bedroom of that farmhouse. A cup of coffee going cold on the nightstand, a radio playing a station that only ever played hymns. I found him, because I was still the one who drove out there every Sunday. I want to tell you about the 11 years before that. Nobody in my family ever said a word about them. Not once. Not even at the reading. I was 22 when my father lost his job at the implement dealer. A round of layoffs nobody saw coming. Not even him. He was 54. Nobody hires a 54-year-old parts manager fast. Not in a town this size. My mother worked part-time at the school cafeteria. $9 an hour. No benefits. The mortgage on the house on Summit Street was $1,140 a month. I know that number because I paid it. Every month. For 11 years. It started small. $300 here. Covering a light bill gone red. Then it was my mother's car payment. $211 a month. Because Sharon Foley wasn't going to be seen driving something with a check engine light on. Not in this town. Then it became the mortgage itself. The whole $1,140. Wired the first of every month, my account to theirs. My father's unemployment ran out. It never turned back into a paycheck. Not a real one. Not one that covered anything. I kept a ledger. I want you to understand that about me first because it matters later. I'm a bookkeeper. I reconcile accounts for a living. I caught a $12,000 error a regional auditor missed. I did it at 11 at night, at my own kitchen table. Coffee going cold beside me, the same way my grandfather let his coffee go cold. I don't think that's a coincidence. I don't argue. I reconcile. That's not a metaphor. That's just what my hands do when the world gets loud. So I kept a shoebox, not a folder, not a spreadsheet, not at first. A cardboard shoebox that used to hold a pair of brown loafers. Every receipt went into it. Every wire confirmation, every photocopied check I ever wrote for my parents' bills. Dated, initialed, in order. 11 years of it. By the time my grandfather died, that shoebox held $134,000 in documented payments. I know the number because I added it twice. The week after the funeral, same kitchen table. Some part of me already knew I'd need it. My brother Cole never paid a bill in his life, as far as I know. He's 36, 3 years older than me. He's been between opportunities, as my mother liked to say, for most of the last decade. 2 years ago, he started a company called Foley Fabrication Solutions. As far as I could tell, it fabricated invoices more reliably than it fabricated anything made of metal. My parents loved talking about Cole's company at dinner. They never once asked me a single question about the Co-op's books. Not in 11 years. Even though I was the one who explained to my father, twice, why his joint account with my mother kept overdrafting. 3 days before the first of the month. Like clockwork. I flexed that muscle again the same week Grandpa died, actually, though I didn't know yet it would matter. The Co-op's regional auditor came through in January. A woman named Patricia Voss from Cedar Rapids. Tall. All business. A laptop bag that looked heavier than she was. She ran her numbers against mine for 2 full days and found nothing. That's the whole point of being good at this job. Then, on the 3rd day, she found something. A transposition. A single decimal moved 1 column over on a grain storage invoice. 12,000 and change. Sitting there since October like a splinter, nobody noticed. I found it before she said a word, just from staring at a trend line. Tuesday afternoon, coffee gone cold beside my keyboard. She looked at me a long moment. "How long have you been doing this?" she said. I told her 11 years. "You should be running audits," she said, "not filing them." I didn't say anything. I just fixed the number and moved to the next line. That's the kind of person I am. I noticed the decimal that's 1 column over. I noticed a lot of decimals over the years. In my parents' life, I never said anything about most of them, because saying something never once changed anything. Reconciling quietly at least kept the lights on. The Tuesday before the will reading, I drove out to see my grandfather one last time before the funeral home came. Walter Henley was already there, standing on the porch, in a dark coat that didn't fit the season, holding a folder against his chest like it might blow away. He'd been Earl Mercer's lawyer for close to 30 years, since before I was born. A small, careful man, reading glasses pushed up into thin grey hair. He had a way of looking at you like he already knew the end of your sentence before you finished it. "Dana," he said, "I'm glad it's you." I asked what he meant by that. He didn't answer directly. He just handed me a plain white envelope, sealed with a small dab of red wax, the old-fashioned kind Grandpa kept in a tin in his desk drawer, for no reason I ever understood until that moment. On the front, in my grandfather's shaking, careful hand, "Keep this until asked." "Asked by who?" I said. "You'll know," Henley said. Not an answer. But it was the only one he'd give me. I put the envelope in my coat pocket. I did not open it. My grandfather asked me not to. In 33 years, I had never once done a single thing that man asked me not to do. I'm not going to tell you what was inside that envelope yet. I want to tell you about the brass key first. It came before the envelope mattered. It's part of how this whole thing got put together, piece by piece, long before any lawyer said the word backup out loud. I found the key in my grandfather's kitchen the same night I found him, sitting in a small ceramic dish on the windowsill above the sink, mixed in with a few paper clips, a rubber band, a church bulletin folded into quarters, the kind of dish that collects the small, useless things of a life without anyone noticing. The key was small, brass old, unlabelled, cut for something that was clearly not the farmhouse door. I put it in my pocket without thinking much about it. You pocket things at a house that's suddenly unbearably quiet. I didn't think about it again for almost 2 weeks. I want to be fair to myself here. I thought about plenty. I thought about the coffee going cold on the nightstand, the radio still playing hymns to an empty room, 11 years of receipts and my mother never once mentioning them. Not to thank me, not even to acknowledge the math of it. Like the money just appeared out of the ground, the way Iowa corn does every August, whether anyone deserves it or not. What I did not think about, not once in 11 years, was that any of it would matter to anyone but me. The reading was on a Tuesday. Henley's office sits above the old hardware store on Main Street, up a narrow staircase that creaks on the 4th step, no matter who's climbing it. It smells like paper and pipe tobacco, though I never once saw the man smoke a pipe. My mother wore a black dress with the tag still cut off that morning. You could tell by the crease. My father sat with his hands folded like church. Cole came 15 minutes late and sat behind us. First thing he said walking in was, Did I miss the good part? Nobody laughed. My mother smiled like he'd told a charming joke. Henley read through the preliminaries. The farmhouse and the 310 acres to my mother and father in trust. The contents of the house, itemised, split between my mother and Cole. A modest life insurance policy, split the same way. Then he got to the line about grandchildren. There wasn't one. My name simply didn't appear. My mother turned to me with that smile, the practiced one. "Oh, sweetheart," she said, "you were only ever our backup plan." Cole didn't look up from his phone. I said nothing. I put my hand in my coat pocket and felt the corner of the envelope, still sealed. I thought, not yet. I signed the acknowledgement form where Henley's finger tapped the line. Nothing in that room was worth fighting for out loud. Not that day. Henley walked me to my car afterward. He didn't do that for my mother or my father. He pressed a small folded note into my hand, along with a business card. Thursday, it said, bring what your grandfather gave you. Nothing else. I looked up and he was already turning back toward us the stairs, coat still not fitting the season. Standing in that gravel parking lot, cold wind off the co-op elevator 2 blocks away, I understood something. Whatever my mother believed had just been settled in that office was not settled at all. I drove home. I didn't cry in the car, though I came close, somewhere around the 4-way stop on Iowa Avenue, not because of the money, because of the sentence. Backup plan. 11 years of wired mortgage payments, and I was a backup plan. I don't argue. I reconcile. I went home and opened the shoebox instead. I laid every receipt out on my kitchen table that night. Date order. The same way I'd laid them out once before, the week after the funeral. $134,000. 11 years. Mortgage wires. Car payment stubs. Co-pays for my father's blood pressure medication. $42 a month. Never got cheaper. The roof repair after the hailstorm in 2021. $6,200. Paid in full by me. My parents' homeowner's policy had lapsed 8 months earlier. Nobody told me until the contractor was standing in the yard. I didn't cry over the pile. I photographed it instead. Every sheet, flat under the kitchen light. That's what you do when you reconcile instead of argue. You make a record. You don't make a scene. Thursday came cold and bright. The kind of Iowa morning where the sun looks sharper than it feels. Henley's office smelled the same as the week before. Paper. Something like old tobacco. The door was locked when I got there, which struck me as strange, until he explained it. Your mother doesn't know you're here, he said, and she can't. Not yet. I sat down across from him and set the sealed envelope on the desk between us, still unopened, 4 words facing up. Keep this until asked. Are you asking? I said. Not yet. Something in the way he said it made my stomach go tight, tighter than it had in that lawyer's office 2 days earlier. Right now I need to ask you something else. Did your grandfather ever give you anything before he passed? A key, a box number, anything like that? I thought about the ceramic dish on the windowsill, the paper clips, the church bulletin folded into quarters. I reached into my bag, pulled out the small brass key I'd been carrying in a zippered pocket for 2 weeks, without a second thought. I set it on the desk next to the envelope. Henley picked it up, turned it once in the light from the window. Marshalltown Savings, he said. I thought so. He mentioned a box years ago. Never told me the number. He handed it back to me. You'll want to go this week, before anyone else thinks to ask what it opens. I asked him plainly what he thought was going on. He folded his hands on the desk, that same patient posture from the reading. He told me only this. The will read on Tuesday was accurate as far as it went. He was bound by law to say nothing more until certain conditions were met. One of those conditions involved the envelope in front of us. It could not be opened until the estate was formally contested. Contested by who? I said. That, Henley said, would be up to you. I left his office without a clear answer, a colder, sharper feeling than I'd walked in with. The feeling you get when a puzzle piece fits somewhere you didn't expect, before you even know what picture it belongs to. Marshalltown Savings and Loan sits 2 blocks off Main Street, a squat brick building that's looked the same since I was a kid. They still keep a bowl of peppermints at the teller window. I told the woman at the desk I had a safe deposit box key with no number on it. She took it back to the vault manager, a heavy-set man named Roy Denby, 3 years ahead of me in high school. Roy came out looking at me strangely, like he was deciding whether to say something. Box 118, he said finally. Under Earl Mercer, he set it up 2 years ago. He paused, listed a second key holder. You, Dana, since the day he opened it. The ground shifted slightly hearing that. The particular feeling of learning you've had access to something the whole time and never even knew to look. Roy walked me back to the vault room, a narrow space lined with small steel doors. Box 118 sat in the third row. Unremarkable, exactly like every other box in the room. Inside was a single ledger, bound in cracked brown leather. My grandfather's handwriting filled every page, the same careful, shaking script that wrote, "Keep this until asked," on the envelope in my bag. Beneath the ledger, a manila folder, thicker than I expected, tied shut with a length of red ribbon. I opened the ledger first. That's what I do. I go in order. The entries went back decades, farm income and expenses, his own hand. But the last third of the book, from roughly 2 years back, was different. Not farm entries. Transfers, dates, account numbers, dollar figures. At the bottom of a page, dated the 3rd of March, the year before he died. One line, underlined twice. Deer Creek Property and all liquid accounts conveyed in trust to DF, retaining nothing to devise. I sat in that little vault room. Roy Denby stood awkwardly by the door, pretending to check his watch. I read that line 4 times before it settled into something I could hold on to. D.F. Dana Foley. I didn't say anything out loud. I closed the ledger. I opened the folder next. Photocopies, a dozen pages at least. On top, a single sheet with a raised notary seal. The words Marshalltown County Recorder's Office stamped across the header. A trust document, dated the same March I just read in the ledger, my grandfather's signature at the bottom. Beneath his, in a smaller printed line, trustee and sole beneficiary, Dana Marie Foley. The books always balance, even when people don't. That's a line I'd hear again later, in his own handwriting. Right then, in a bank vault 2 blocks from Main Street, I only felt the floor of my whole life quietly rearranging itself, one plank at a time, without a single sound. I didn't tell my mother, I didn't tell my father, I certainly didn't tell Cole. I drove home. I called Walter Henley from my kitchen table. I told him what I'd found. A long pause on the line before he spoke again. "Now we're asking," he said. "Open the envelope." I broke my grandfather's wax seal at my own kitchen table, alone. The ledger and the folder from the vault spread out in front of me, evidence for a trial I hadn't known I was building. Inside the envelope, a single folded sheet. A short letter, the same careful hand. Dana. You were never the backup. You were the only one who showed up. Everything I have is already yours, on paper, since before I died. Your mother does not know. She will find out the way people find out things they should have already known, in front of everyone. I am sorry to leave that to you, but you are the only one steady enough to carry it. The books always balance. It just takes some people longer than others to notice. I sat with that letter a long time. I did not cry, not the way you might expect. Not loudly. What I felt was closer to relief. The kind you feel when a column of numbers you've stared at for years finally comes out even. I want to be honest about one more thing, because it matters for what comes next. I didn't understand right away why my mother needed the will to say what it said, why she needed to sit in that office and call me a backup plan in front of a lawyer who already knew better. At first I assumed it was simple cruelty, the kind she'd shown me in smaller doses my whole life. It would take 2 more weeks. A locked desk drawer in my father's study. A phone call from a bank in Des Moines. Then I understood. It was never really about cruelty at all. It was about a number, a very large number. One my parents had already spent, against a farm that was never legally theirs to spend against. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me go back to that Thursday night, sitting at my kitchen table with a ledger, a trust document, and a letter. A letter from a dead man who trusted me more than his own daughter ever had. I didn't do anything rash. I want to say that clearly. It would have been easy that night to drive straight to Summit Street and put the trust document down on my mother's counter. Watch her face while she read it. I thought about it. I decided against it. Not mercy, exactly. Habit. I reconcile, I don't argue. Reconciling meant understanding the whole picture first, so the next morning I called Henley again. He told me the trust was valid and recorded. Dated, notarized, sitting in the county recorder's office exactly where it should be. Whatever the will said on Tuesday, it didn't matter. The farm and the accounts it referenced had already left my grandfather's estate more than a year before he died. The will was reading off a shelf that had already been emptied. My mother and father had inherited, in writing, land and money that legally did not exist to inherit, because it had already been given away, quietly to me. Why wouldn't he just tell them, I asked. Why do it this way? Let them stand up in your office and celebrate an inheritance that wasn't real. Henley was quiet a moment on the phone. He didn't trust them not to fight it while he was alive, he said. He told me once, and I'm only repeating it now because you need to hear it. If Sharon found out too soon, she'd spend the money before he was even in the ground. I didn't fully understand what that meant. Not until the following week, when I started noticing things I'd spent 11 years training myself not to notice. My father had a locked drawer in his desk. In the small room off the kitchen, he called his study. Nobody in that house had studied anything in it in 20 years. I'd seen that drawer locked my whole life and never once thought about it. The way you stop seeing a stain on a carpet after enough years stepping around it. 3 days after the reading, I came by with groceries, the way I still did every week out of 11 years of habit. I found my mother standing at that desk, drawer open, sliding papers into a folder. Hands moving fast. She startled when she saw me, which she never did, not with me. Not in that house where I'd made myself invisible enough to be useful for over a decade. What are those? I asked. Plain and flat. No accusation in my voice. Accusation gets you nothing but a slammed door. Nothing that concerns you, she said. This was never going to concern you. I noticed a letterhead on the corner of one page before she closed the folder. A bank in Des Moines, not Marshalltown Savings, where I had box 118 and a small brass key. A different bank, 2 counties over. The kind of bank people use when they don't want the local tellers, people they've known since grade school, asking questions over the counter. I said nothing else. I put the groceries away the way I always did. I left. I called Walter Henley from my car in the driveway before I'd even pulled onto the street. Des Moines, I said. Ring a bell? A pause. The kind that told me more than words would have. Come by tomorrow, Henley said. Bring the ledger. What we found the next day, cross-referencing my grandfather's handwriting against a public lien filing Henley had pulled that morning, was this. 2 years before he died, my parents had taken out a loan against the Deer Creek farm. $312,000. Collateralized by land they did not yet legally own, but fully expected to inherit. Land my grandfather had already signed away, 11 months earlier, without telling them. The money hadn't gone to home repairs or medical bills. It had gone almost entirely into Cole's company, Foley Fabrication Solutions, which by the bank's own records had never turned a profit. Missed payroll twice in the past year. Total assets, $14,000. Total debts, just under $400,000. I sat in Henley's office with that number in front of me. $312,000. I thought about the $1,140 a month I'd wired without fail for 11 years. The $42 co-pays. The $6,000 roof. Something in me that I'd kept very carefully still, for a very long time, did not break exactly. But it finally moved. They knew, I said. They knew the loan was worthless collateral. They just needed the will to say the farm was theirs, long enough to keep the bank from asking questions. That would be my read as well, Henley said. He didn't sound surprised. I had the sense he'd suspected this shape of things for longer than he'd let on. Waiting, the way careful men wait, for the pieces to arrange themselves into something he could act on cleanly. And cutting me out of the will, I said. That wasn't really about me at all, was it? No, Henley said, not unkindly. I don't believe it was. Your mother needed a clean, uncontested will on record. One naming her and your father sole heirs to that farm, before the bank's next review. A grandchild with a claim, even an unclear one, would have muddied the title. I want to tell you I felt triumphant, sitting there with the shape of the whole thing finely visible. What I actually felt was tired, the particular tiredness of understanding, all at once, what 11 years of quiet devotion had really been. To the people receiving it, simply a resource to be managed. The same way the loan officer in Des Moines was a resource. The same way the farm itself was a resource. Right up until the resource stopped being useful. I don't argue. I reconcile. So that week, instead of confronting anyone, I did what I've always done with numbers that don't add up. I built the file. Henley and I spent 4 days authenticating the trust's recording date against the county clerk's stamp, cross-checking my grandfather's signature against 3 prior notarized documents to rule out any question of capacity or coercion, quietly requesting, through Henley's contact at the recorder's office, a certified copy of the loan's collateral filing. There was a moment midway through that week, sitting across from Henley with the certified copies spread between us. He looked up at me and said something I've thought about more than almost anything else in this story. "You could let this go," he said. "The trust protects you regardless. You don't have to be the one who tells them." I thought about that longer than I expected to. I thought about my mother's smile at the reading, warm and practiced and utterly empty. I thought about Cole not looking up from his phone. I thought about the shoebox and the 11 years, and 4 words on an envelope I'd carried in my pocket without asking a single question, because that's who my grandfather raised me to be, even from 310 acres away. "No," I said. "I want them to hear it read out loud, the same way I heard mine." Henley nodded slowly, the way you nod at a number that finally, after a long column, comes out even. "Then we'll need a formal contest of the will," he said, "and a settlement meeting. All parties present." "Good," I said. "Set the date." "I want to tell you what happened at that meeting." "I will. But there's one more piece I have to give you first. It changes the shape of everything after, and it came from a place I never expected to find it. A bottom drawer in my own grandfather's ledger, tucked behind the last page, in an envelope I almost missed entirely. I want to tell you what happened at that meeting. I will. But first, one more piece. I found it back at the vault on Saturday, mostly to double-check dates for Henley. This time I turned every page of that leather ledger, not just the ones with numbers on them. Behind the final page, tucked into the binding itself, sat a second, thinner envelope, unmarked. I'd missed it the first time. It had settled flat against the back cover, like it belonged to the book itself. Inside were 4 things. I laid them out on the little steel counter in the vault room, the way I lay out receipts on my kitchen table. In order. That's the only way I know how to look at anything. The first was a photocopy of the original 1974 deed to the farm. My great-grandfather's name on it. Plot lines hand-drawn by a county surveyor. Dead for decades. The second was a bank statement from Marshalltown Savings, an account I'd never heard of. Opened the same March as the trust. $61,000. Also in my name. A fact I would not have believed if I hadn't been staring at my own name printed on the header. The third was a copy of Cole's original loan application to the bank in Des Moines. $312,000. Stapled to the back, a copy of the county lien filing. My parents as applicants and guarantors. Dated 11 months after the trust had already been recorded, meaning the collateral they'd pledged had never, for one single day, belonged to them. The fourth was a single index card. My grandfather's hand again, smaller this time, like he'd written it in a hurry, or with less strength left in it. "Count carefully," it said. "There's always one more page than they think there is." I sat with that card a long time. I understood finally why he'd built it this way. In tiers. A ledger, then a folder, then a hidden envelope inside the ledger itself. Each one only findable if you were patient enough, careful enough to keep turning pages after most people would have stopped. He hadn't just protected the farm, he'd built a test. One only someone who reconciled instead of argued would ever pass. My mother would have stopped at the will. My father wouldn't have gone looking at all. I called Henley from the bank parking lot. For the first time in the whole month, I heard something in his voice that sounded almost like relief. "That settles the last question," he said. I wasn't certain the second envelope existed. He mentioned it to me once, years ago, in passing. I never confirmed it. "What last question?" I asked. "Whether he intended for you to find it on your own," Henley said, "or whether I was meant to lead you to it eventually. It matters for how we present this. If you found it yourself unassisted, there's no question of undue influence on my part. It strengthens everything." I hadn't thought of it that way, but I understood immediately. I felt, for the first time since the reading, something closer to steadiness than grief. There's one more thing I have to tell you before the meeting. It's the part that still makes my stomach turn, a little, even now. It happened at a dinner I almost didn't go to. My mother called me on a Tuesday night, her voice warm in a way it hadn't been with me in years. She asked if I'd come by Sunday. Just family, she said. Nothing formal. I knew by then what I knew. I went anyway because Henley had asked me to. Quietly. A way of gauging what my mother actually understood about her own situation before the settlement meeting. Dinner was pot roast. The same pot roast my mother made every Sunday of my childhood. For most of the meal, she talked about Coles Company like it was thriving. A new contract coming in from a plant in Waterloo. She said, "Any day now." I asked, as innocently as I could manage, whether the loan from the Des Moines Bank had helped get things off the ground. My father's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. My mother's smile flickered, just at the edges. The way a light flickers right before it goes out for good. "What loan?" she said. "The one against the farm," I said. "I only asked because I heard the bank does a collateral review every 2 years. Just wondered if that was coming up soon." Nobody at that table said another word about it. But I watched my mother's hand tighten around her wineglass. I watched my father look, just once, toward the closed door of his study. I understood, watching them both go quiet over pot roast, that they had no idea how close that review actually was, or what it would find when it came. I drove home that night. I did not feel triumphant. Mostly I felt sad, the particular sadness of watching two people you love sit at a table, not knowing the ground beneath them had already given way months earlier, being the only person in the room who knew it. I want to be honest with you about something else too, because this story isn't really about the money. Not at its centre. It's about 11 years of being useful without ever once being valued, about the moment you realise the difference between the two, about what you do once you know it for certain. I didn't build a case against my parents because I wanted their farm. I already had it, in writing, since before my grandfather died. I built the case because I wanted something. Once, in that same office where they'd called me a backup plan, to be heard reading the truth out loud, not sitting quietly while someone else's version of it got written into the record. Henley set the settlement meeting for 2 weeks out. All parties present, he said. A formal hearing on the will contest. The trust and its supporting documents entered as evidence. My mother, when she got the notice, called me twice. Both voicemails started warm and ended sharp, asking what exactly I thought I was doing, reminding me that family didn't drag family into lawyers' offices over a farmhouse and a savings account. I didn't call her back either time. I let the receipts speak instead, the same way I'd let them speak quietly for 11 years, while nobody was listening. 2 days before the meeting, my father showed up at the co-op unannounced, standing awkwardly by the grain scale while I finished a call. When I hung up, he asked, not unkindly, if there was any way to make this go away quietly, just between family. "There's nothing to make go away," I told him. "The trust already exists. It existed before Grandpa died. I'm not taking anything from you. I'm just not going to keep holding up what was never mine to hold up." He didn't have an answer for that. He stood there a moment longer, looking older than I remembered. Then he left. I went back to my ledgers, because the co-op's numbers still had to balance, whether or not my family's did. I spent those last 2 days before the meeting the way I spend most difficult days, quietly, with a great deal of paper. I made 3 copies of everything: the original 1974 deed, the trust document with its county stamp, the loan application with my parents' names as guarantors, the bank statement in my name, my grandfather's ledger with its underlined line, and his letter, which I did not copy. Some things aren't evidence, they're simply mine. Henley called the night before to walk through the order of what would be presented. Near the end of the call, he told me something that stuck with me longer than almost anything else in this whole ordeal. "Your grandfather asked me once what I thought made a person trustworthy," he said. I told him honesty. He said no, that's not it at all. He said a trustworthy person keeps doing the right thing long after they've stopped expecting anyone to notice. He said that's you. More than once, actually. I didn't say anything for a moment. I thought about 11 years of wire transfers nobody ever thanked me for, about a shoebox full of receipts I'd kept. Not because I expected to need them, because that's how I keep track of things I care about. "Thank you for telling me that," I said. I meant it more than almost anything I'd said in weeks. I slept badly that night. I want to admit that plainly. I don't want you to think any of this felt easy from the inside. I kept thinking about my mother's face across the will reading table, the practiced warmth of it, wondering whether anything I was about to do would actually reach her, or whether it would simply confirm, in her mind, that I'd always been the difficult one, the one who couldn't let things lie. I got up before dawn, made coffee, let it go cold on the counter, the way my grandfather always did. I sat with the folder of documents in front of me until it was time to go. The morning of the meeting was overcast, the kind of flat, grey Iowa sky that makes everything underneath it look smaller than it is. Henley's office had been rearranged, a longer table brought in from somewhere, extra chairs along the wall for a court reporter Henley had insisted on, quietly, over my mother's objection when she heard about it. My mother arrived first, same black dress from the will reading. I wondered, watching her settle into her chair with that same composed posture, whether she had any idea what this meeting actually was, or whether she still believed, right up until she sat down, that this was simply her difficult daughter, fussing over a farmhouse she'd never wanted anyway. My father came in behind her. He wouldn't look at me, not once, the whole time he crossed the room. Cole arrived last, 7 minutes late, same as the will reading. He sat down across from me without a nod, checked his phone one more time before Henley cleared his throat, and the room went quiet. "We're here," Henley said, "to formally contest the distribution outlined in Earl Mercer's will. Read in this office 3 weeks ago, on the grounds that the assets in question had already been legally conveyed prior to his death." My mother's posture didn't change. "Not yet." "This is unnecessary," she said. "The will was clear. Dana, I understand this is difficult, but there's simply nothing more to discuss." "There's quite a bit more to discuss," Henley said. He opened the folder in front of him. For the first time since the reading, I watched my mother's expression begin, very slightly, to shift. Henley started with the deed, the original 1974 document, my great-grandfather's signature, the surveyor's hand-drawn plot lines. He set it on the table and turned it so my mother could see it clearly. Though she'd seen it 100 times before, framed in her own father's hallway her entire life. "Nobody disputes the property's history," my mother said. "I don't understand what this accomplishes." "Bear with me," Henley said. He set the second document beside it. The trust, dated in March, recorded at the county. My grandfather's signature. Beneath it, the printed line naming the trustee and sole beneficiary. He didn't read the name out loud yet. He just let the document sit there, facing her, while she read it herself. I watched her eyes move across that page once, then a second time. The way you reread a sentence, you're certain you must have misunderstood the first time. Her hand resting on the table went very still. "This is dated before he died," she said quietly now, the warmth gone from her voice entirely. "This is dated over a year before he died." "It is," Henley said. "Recorded the same week. A matter of public record. Anyone could have checked the county clerk's office." "Then the will," my father said, speaking for the first time, his voice thin. "The will we read 3 weeks ago was accurate as written," Henley said. "It simply had nothing left to distribute regarding the Deer Creek property, or the accounts referenced in it. Your father-in-law had already moved those assets in full, retaining nothing to devise, as the trust states." Cole looked up from his phone for the first time since sitting down. "Wait," he said. "So the farm was never actually—" He stopped himself. Not soon enough. Something passed across my mother's face. I can only describe it as the fear of a person watching two separate lies collide in the same room. "Sharon," Henley said. His voice, though still even, carried a different weight now. The weight of a man laying the last card down instead of the first. "I have one more document. Then I think we understand each other." He set down the loan application, $312,000. The bank in Des Moines, my parents' names as applicants and guarantors. The Deer Creek parcel listed as collateral, dated 11 months after the trust had already been recorded. The room went very quiet. My mother didn't touch the page. She looked at it the way you look at something you already know, somewhere, is true, but have spent a great deal of energy convincing yourself is not. "You pledged land that was no longer yours to pledge," Henley said. "The bank's collateral review is scheduled in 6 weeks. It will find a lien against a title transferred out of the estate before the loan was ever issued. I've spoken with counsel. That's grounds, at minimum, for the loan's immediate call. Depending on what the bank's fraud examiners find, potentially a great deal more. My father's face went the colour of the grey sky outside the window. My mother's hand finally moved, reaching for the loan application, though she didn't pick it up, just rested her fingers on its edge, as if touching it might change what it said. We needed the loan for Cole's company, she said very quietly now. Not to Henley. Not really to anyone. More like she was saying it out loud to see if it still sounded reasonable, once it left her mouth. We were going to pay it back once the farm sold. We assumed. You assumed the farm was yours to sell, Henley said. It was not. It has not been. For well over a year. Cole set his phone down on the table, finally fully present in the room for the first time since he'd walked in. Whose farm is it? He asked. I understood, hearing the question out loud, that some part of him already knew the answer. He was simply waiting for someone else to say it. The way you wait for someone else to confirm a diagnosis you've already guessed at. Nobody answered right away. My mother turned slowly and looked at me for the first time since we'd all sat down. I watched the practiced warmth try one more time to surface in her expression, and fail completely. Dana, she said. What did you do? I didn't do anything, I said, calmly, the way I say most things. For the first time in this entire ordeal, I didn't need to raise my voice to be believed. Grandpa did it. Over a year before he died. I only found out the same week you did. Standing in a bank vault with a key he'd given me without telling me what it opened. You knew, my mother said. At the reading. You sat there and let me say that to you. And you knew. I had an envelope in my pocket, I said. I didn't open it until Henley told me to. I followed his instructions the same way I followed Grandpa's. I didn't lie to you, Mum. I just didn't correct you in front of a room full of people. The same courtesy you've never once extended to me. I watched that land. I want to be honest, it didn't feel like triumph. Watching my mother's face come apart piece by piece, the practiced smile gone, the warmth gone. Nothing left underneath it but the particular fear of a person realizing all at once exactly how much they had already lost. Let me explain what that meeting actually was, because it matters for what came next. That room that Tuesday was a private contest hearing. Family and council only, a court reporter taking everything down for the record. But no public docket yet. No filing entered with the county. Nothing that couldn't still, in theory, be quietly unwound, if my mother found a way to argue the trust's validity before it became official. Henley had planned it that way on purpose. He wanted the family to understand what was coming. Before the record made it permanent, he told me later. Not out of mercy for my mother. The family had to be warned first, given a chance to respond. Once that happened, an uncontested formal filing would be far harder for anyone to challenge afterward. This isn't final, Henley told me, after my parents and Cole had left that afternoon. My mother's hand had been shaking so badly, my father needed to help her out of her chair. This was the warning shot, the formal probate hearing, the one that actually enters the trust into the county record and settles the estate. It's still 6 weeks out. That's the one that matters. That's the one where this becomes public. I asked why it needed to be public at all, if the private meeting had already made the truth clear to everyone in the room. Because your mother has spent 11 years managing what people in this town believe about her family, Henley said. A quiet private settlement lets her keep managing it. A formal hearing, entered into open record, with the bank's fraud examiner likely present, does not. I sat with that a long moment. Part of me wanted the quiet version. Part of me still does. Even now. But I thought about 11 years of a shoebox nobody ever asked about. About a mother who could sit across a table and call me a backup plan with a straight face. Confident no one would ever know differently. I understood that quiet, in my family, had always been a mechanism for keeping the truth on their terms. Never mine. Let it be public, I said. Let the record say what it says. The 6 weeks between that private meeting and the formal hearing were harder, in their own way, than anything before them had been. For 6 weeks I watched my family come apart slowly, never quite dramatic enough to be called a single event. Just a long, grinding accumulation of consequences, finding the people who'd earned them. My mother called 11 times in the first 10 days. I know the number because I wrote it down. That's just what I do. 4 of those calls she was angry, telling me I was destroying the family over land I didn't even want when I was younger. That I'd chosen this moment out of spite, that Grandpa would be ashamed of what I was doing to his daughter. 3 of the calls, she cried. Real crying. The kind that made me sit very still and say very little. I didn't trust my own voice not to soften into something she could use. The last 4 calls, in the final week, she didn't say much of anything. She just asked, in a smaller voice than I'd ever heard from her, whether she'd still get to keep the house on Summit Street. I told her the truth every time. The house was never part of the trust. It had always belonged to her and my father, outright. Mortgage or no mortgage. Nothing Henley and I were doing touched it. What was in question was the farm, the accounts. Whatever the bank decided to do about a loan built on collateral that never existed. She never seemed to fully hear that part. I think by then the fear had gotten too large to let facts back in through the same door. Cole stopped answering my calls entirely, which was, in its own way, an answer. I heard through my father, in one of 2 brief conversations we had those 6 weeks, an update. Cole had let go of both employees at Foley Fabrication Solutions in the 2nd week. That the plant contract in Waterloo he'd talked about at dinner never existed at all. My father delivered that detail flatly. No commentary. Like a man reading a line off a form, he no longer had the energy to argue with. My father, of the 3 of them, surprised me most. He came by the co-op again in the 4th week, this time not asking me to make anything go away, just standing by the grain scale a long while before he finally spoke. I should have asked how you were managing all those years, he said. The mortgage, the bills. I let your mother handle the books at home. I never once asked where the money actually came from. Some part of me didn't want to know. Knowing would have meant admitting I couldn't do it myself anymore. I didn't have a response ready for that, which almost never happens to me. I told him eventually that I hadn't done it to be thanked. I'd done it because somebody had to, and I was the one who could. He nodded. He didn't apologise. Not exactly. Not in words. But something in the way he stood there, smaller than I remembered, told me he understood. Finally, what 11 years had actually cost, and who'd been paying for it the whole time. The bank's collateral review didn't wait politely for the county hearing. Word came through Henley in the 5th week. Marshalltown Savings and Loans Des Moines branch had flagged the Deer Creek loan for early review. A routine title search, unrelated to our filing, had turned up the recorded trust. The loan officer who'd approved the original application, a man named Grantham, had pledged his own reputation on it without personally verifying the title. The bank was already looking closely at whether that approval had cut corners it shouldn't have. They'll call the loan the moment the trust is entered into the formal record, Henley told me. There's nothing left to secure it. Your mother and father will owe $312,000. Unsecured. Effective the day the hearing concludes. I asked what happened to people who owed that kind of money with no way to pay it. Some things become the county's business, he said. Some things become the bank's business. Possibly a fraud examiner's business, depending on what the application review turns up. That part isn't in your hands anymore, Dana. It hasn't been since the day your grandfather set his pen down on that trust. I want to tell you honestly, I did not enjoy hearing that. I didn't spend those 6 weeks imagining my parents' ruin with any satisfaction. What I felt, mostly, watching it arrive one piece at a time, was closer to exhaustion. The particular exhaustion of watching gravity finally do the thing gravity does. After years of quietly propping a structure up, so it never got the chance. I kept working at the co-op through those 6 weeks, the way I'd kept working through everything else in my life. Patricia Voss noticed, I think, that something was different, though she never asked directly. She just started leaving me alone with the harder accounts, the ones that needed real focus. As if she understood that focus was exactly what I needed most. I want to tell you now about the formal hearing. It's the part I haven't given you yet, and it's the part that actually settled everything, in public, on the record, in a way nothing before it had. The formal probate hearing happened 6 weeks after that private meeting, exactly as Henley had planned it. Unlike the private contest, this one ran on the public docket. In an actual courtroom, with an actual judge. Anyone in Marshalltown with a reason to be there was free to walk in and sit down. I want to tell you who was in that room, because it mattered more than I expected. My mother and father sat at one table with their own attorney, a younger man from Cedar Rapids I didn't recognise. Hired, I assumed, sometime in the last 6 weeks. Once it became clear Henley wasn't going to soften anything for them. Cole sat one row back, alone, his phone nowhere in sight, for the first time in this entire story. Roy Denby from the bank was there too, a folder of his own on his lap. Beside him sat a woman in a grey suit I didn't know, the collateral fraud examiner from the Des Moines branch, sent to observe. Whatever the judge decided would determine the bank's next move on the loan. Near the back, in a pew normally reserved for the public, sat 6 or 7 people from town I recognised without quite placing. Word of this had travelled the way word travels in a town this size, quietly, thoroughly. Through the co-op, the diner, the church parking lot. Long before any of us walked through the courthouse doors. The judge, a woman named Carol Whitfield, opened the hearing plainly. She read the docket number and the matter at hand. The contest of the last will and testament of Earl Mercer, the petition to formally recognise a prior trust instrument. Henley stood first. He laid it out for the record the same way he'd laid it out for my parents 6 weeks earlier. Methodically, one document at a time. Except this time every word went into an official transcript. Every person in that gallery heard it the moment it was said, not filtered through a family dinner table or a private office with the blinds drawn. He entered the original 1974 deed. He entered the trust, dated and recorded over a year before Earl Mercer's death, naming Dana Marie Foley as trustee and sole beneficiary, retaining nothing to devise. He entered the certified copy of the loan application from the Des Moines Bank, the collateral pledged against a title that had already left the estate 11 months earlier. My parents' signatures, as applicants and guarantors, clearly visible on the copy projected onto the screen at the front of the courtroom. I watched my mother's attorney lean over and say something to her, low and urgent. I watched her shake her head once sharply, the same gesture I remembered from 100 family arguments over the years, the one that meant she'd already decided the conversation was over. Judge Whitfield reviewed the documents in silence for a long moment. The only sound in the room was the soft hum of the ventilation system. Somewhere behind me, a chair creaked as someone shifted their weight. "Mr. Henley," she said finally, "is there any dispute as to the trust document's authenticity, the notary's seal, the recording date at the county clerk's office?" "None, Your Honour," Henley said. "All independently verifiable. I'd also note for the record that my client did not seek this instrument out. She was made aware of its existence only after her grandfather's death, through means he arranged himself." "And the loan," Judge Whitfield said, turning to my mother's attorney. "Counsel, does your client dispute the Deer Creek parcel was already conveyed out of the estate when the application was submitted?" A long pause. My mother's attorney glanced at her once. Whatever he saw in her face seemed to answer the question before he spoke. "We do not dispute the recording date, Your Honour," he said quietly. "We'd ask the court to consider that my clients believed in good faith that the property would eventually pass to them, that any misrepresentation on the loan application was not—" "Counsel," Judge Whitfield said, not unkindly, just flat. The flatness of someone who'd heard a version of this sentence many times before. Good faith belief about a future inheritance doesn't entitle a person to pledge property before they legally hold title to it. That's the entire purpose of recording instruments like this one. I'll allow further argument regarding intent at a separate proceeding, should the bank or the county attorney pursue one. Today's matter is simpler. She turned back to the documents in front of her. This was the moment, the one I'd carried an envelope in my pocket toward for weeks, though I hadn't known it at the time. Sitting in that folding chair, at the will reading, my hand pressed against a sealed corner I wasn't allowed to open. I want to back up a little, before I tell you what the judge decided. There's a piece of those 6 weeks I skipped over. It matters. I almost left it out entirely. About 4 weeks into the waiting period, Henley called with an update I wasn't expecting. The bank's internal counsel had reached out to him directly. Not about the trust, about the loan officer Grantham. About a pattern his supervisors had started noticing, once the Deer Creek application got flagged. "There's more here than one bad approval," Henley told me. The bank's internal audit found 2 other loans in the past 3 years. Grantham skipped the same verification step both times. Collateral that turned out encumbered or not fully owned by the applicant. The kind of basic title search would have caught. I asked what that meant for my parents specifically. "It means the bank's own negligence is now part of this story," Henley said. "That doesn't erase what your parents signed. But the fraud examiner isn't just looking at them anymore. She's looking at whether the bank's own controls failed badly enough to share the blame." I sat with that a while after we hung up. Part of me had expected everything to sort itself cleanly. People who did wrong, and people who didn't. It never works that way. Not completely. My parents signed a loan application built on a false premise. But a bank employee rubber-stamped it without doing the one thing his job required. 2 failures stacked on top of each other. Both of them true at once. I mentioned it to my father next time I saw him at the co-op, mostly because I thought he deserved to know the picture was more complicated than just his own mistake. He didn't take much comfort in it. "It doesn't change what we did," he said. "It just means we found someone careless enough to let us do it." I didn't have an answer for that. I still don't, really. I think he was right. I think it was one of the more honest things he said to me that whole 6 weeks. There was another development in that same stretch. One that came from a direction I hadn't expected at all. A woman named Ellen Marsh ran the church's benevolence fund on the east side of town. She called me one evening, careful, delicate, asking whether my mother had reached out to me about anything. I told her no, not about money. She went quiet a second before telling me why she was asking. My mother had applied to the fund for an emergency grant. $800. Groceries, a utility bill. The kind of thing the fund existed for. Ellen wasn't calling to shame her, and she made that clear. The fund's rules required a family support check before dispersing anything over $500. My mother had listed me as a resource who could help, then declined to actually ask me. "I wanted to ask you directly," Ellen said, "rather than assume anything, one way or the other." I told her the truth. I wasn't in a position anymore to keep functioning as an invisible safety net. Not for a family that had spent 11 years treating that safety net as an entitlement, not a gift. I told her the fund should evaluate my mother's application on its own terms, the way it would for anyone else in town, without factoring me in at all. Ellen thanked me. The fund approved the grant 2 days later. I never heard another word about it. It felt, in its own small way, like exactly the right outcome. My mother got help. It didn't come from me. Both of those things could be true. I want to tell you about one more scene from those 6 weeks. It's the one that changed how I thought about the whole ordeal, more than the courtroom ever did. 10 days before the formal hearing, I drove out to the farmhouse on a Saturday. A land surveyor Henley had recommended was walking the property with me. We needed an updated boundary survey on file before the trust's recognition made everything official. Checking a fence line near the east pasture, I found something I hadn't expected. A small wooden cross, weathered grey, planted at the edge of a stand of cottonwoods. No name on it, no marker beyond the cross itself. I asked Roy Denby about it later. His family had farmed near the Mercer land for 2 generations. He told me what he remembered hearing as a boy. My grandmother Ruth had lost a baby before my mother was born. Stillborn, in a year Roy's own mother remembered, only vaguely. Earl had buried the child himself out past the pasture. The family couldn't afford a proper plot in town at the time. By the time they could, nobody wanted to move a resting place that had already settled into the ground. I stood at that cross a long time. In a stretch of pasture I now legally owned, thinking about my mother, growing up in a house shaped by a grief she may never have known the details of, a sibling she never met, buried quietly by a father who almost never spoke of it. I don't offer this as an excuse for anything she did. I don't think grief, however old, entitles anyone to call the person who wired their mortgage for 11 years a backup plan. But I understood, standing there, something about my grandfather. He'd spent his whole life quietly managing losses nobody else in the family fully saw. The baby in the pasture. My grandmother gone too early. And later, in his own quiet way, a granddaughter he decided deliberately he was not going to let become another loss he managed alone. I didn't tell my mother about the cross. I still haven't. I don't know if she knows it's there all these years later, or if she's simply carried an old, unspoken absence in that house without ever putting a shape to it. Some things, I've come to believe, aren't mine to hand to someone else, even when I'm the one who happens to find them. I drove home from the farmhouse that evening, thinking less about the hearing coming in 10 days, more about how many quiet, private griefs get buried under a family's daily noise. Never spoken of, never resolved, simply carried forward by whoever's steady enough to keep carrying things. I understood, driving back into town, under a sky just starting to go orange at the edges, something about myself too. I'd spent 11 years being exactly that kind of steady, for people who never once asked what it was costing me. And my grandfather, in his own quiet way, had spent his last year making sure that particular arrangement finally came to an end. The days right before the hearing moved strangely, too slow in the mornings, too fast by evening. I kept the folder of documents on my kitchen table the whole week. I checked it each night. The way you check a stove you're almost certain you already turned off. Henley called twice that final week, both times just to confirm small procedural details, whether I'd wear something simple, nothing that looked like I'd dressed for a performance, whether I understood the court reporter would be present again, this time on the official record. Anything said in that room would exist, permanently, as public fact. I told him I understood. I'd understood since the day he handed me that sealed envelope on my grandfather's porch. My mother tried one more time to reach me, 4 days before the hearing. Not by phone this time. Through my father, who came by the co-op again, looking thinner than I remembered. His coat hung a little loose at the shoulders. She wants to know if there's any way to settle this privately, he said. Before Tuesday. There's nothing left to settle, I told him. The trust already exists. It's already recorded. Tuesday just makes it official on a public record. That's not something I'm negotiating away. She's scared, Dana, he said. I don't think you understand how scared. I thought about that a long moment before I answered. I do understand, I said. I understood it 11 years ago, every time I wired that mortgage payment, wondering what would happen to both of you if I ever stopped. I just don't think being scared entitles anyone to call the person holding it together a backup plan. He didn't have anything to say to that. He nodded the way he'd started nodding more often those 6 weeks, like a man slowly running out of arguments he'd once believed in completely. He left without asking again. I want to tell you about the Sunday before the hearing too. It's the last quiet moment I had before everything became public. I think about it more than almost anything else. From that whole stretch. I drove out to the farmhouse alone that afternoon, not for any particular reason, just to sit on the porch my grandfather built, the way I'd started doing most Sundays since he died. The place was still legally his, technically, until the hearing made the trust official. But it already felt like mine, in every way that mattered. I sat there with a cup of coffee going cold beside me, watching the light move across the east pasture. I thought about everything that had happened since that grey Tuesday in Henley's office. I thought about the shoebox, about the brass key in the ceramic dish, about the ledger in the vault, the envelope tucked behind its last page, the wooden cross out past the fence line I still hadn't told anyone else about. I thought about 11 years of wire transfers, how strange it was that all of it led here. Every dollar, every copay, every late-night reconciliation. Quietly leading toward this one Tuesday, though I'd never once seen it coming. I didn't feel nervous sitting there. I want to tell you that honestly, because I think you might expect me to have been. I felt something closer to readiness, the particular calm of a person who has already done all the work there was to do. Now she only has to walk into a room, let the truth speak for itself, in its own voice, for the first time in 11 years. I drove home before dark. I slept that night, better than I expected to. Some part of me understood, lying there in the quiet. Whatever happened the next morning, I'd already won the only thing that ever actually mattered to me. Not the farm, not the money, just the plain, simple fact of it. I would never again have to wonder whether the people I loved most would ever notice what I was carrying for them. The morning of the hearing arrived overcast, the way I've already told you. Flat grey light through my kitchen window while I dressed. I want to add one detail I left out before. Before I left the house, I took my grandfather's letter out of the drawer where I'd been keeping it. I read it one more time, standing at my own kitchen counter, coffee going cold beside me the way his always had. You were never the backup. You were the only one who showed up. I folded it back up, put it in my coat pocket. The same pocket that had once held a sealed envelope I wasn't allowed to open. I drove to the county courthouse to hear, finally, in a room full of witnesses, what that sentence was actually worth. The courthouse parking lot was fuller than I expected for a Tuesday morning. I recognised a few of the cars right away. Patricia Voss's grey sedan, parked near the entrance. Though I hadn't told her the exact time, Roy Denby's truck 2 rows over. I hadn't asked either of them to come. I found out later from Henley that word had simply moved through the co-op, the way it always did. People had decided, on their own, this was a morning worth showing up for. I sat in my car a few minutes before going in. Engine off, hands on the wheel, the folder of documents on the passenger seat beside me. I thought about my grandfather teaching me, at 19, how to reconcile a checkbook in this same kind of quiet, before the work moment. Sit with the numbers first. Understand the whole page before you touch a single line. I took a breath, gathered the folder, and went inside. The courthouse hallway smelled like floor wax and old radiator heat, the way every county building in this part of Iowa seems to smell, no matter the season. Henley was waiting near the courtroom doors, in a charcoal suit I hadn't seen him wearing before. He nodded once when he saw me, the way you'd nod at a colleague arriving for an ordinary day's work. I understood. Even then, that was exactly the tone he wanted to set. Not a spectacle. A procedure. Something calm and orderly, and entirely within the rules. Ready, he asked. I've been ready for 11 years, I told him. I meant it more plainly than it might sound. He almost smiled at that. The closest I'd seen him come to it. The whole month we'd worked together. Then he opened the door and we walked in. The gallery had already started filling by the time we sat down at the plaintiff's table. Henley told me later the clerk's office had started calling it that once word of the case spread. I set my folder down, squared the edges, the way I do with every stack of paper I've ever touched. I looked up just as my mother came through the double doors at the back. She looked smaller than she had at the private meeting 6 weeks earlier. I don't think she'd actually lost any weight or height in that time. It was something else. The particular way a person shrinks, walking into a room, knowing it already understands more about their life than they'd like it to. My father walked beside her, a hand hovering near her elbow not quite touching, the way you'd guide someone across ice you weren't sure would hold. Cole came in last, as always. This time he wasn't late. He'd simply waited outside a moment longer than the rest of them. I understood why the second I saw his face. Whatever composure he'd faked his way through for most of his adult life had worn thin those 6 weeks. He looked, walking in, like a man arriving at his own sentencing, not a hearing about his parents' farm. I want to tell you something, before I get to what the judge said. Watching the three of them cross that room, I felt something unexpected. Not triumph, not even satisfaction. Something closer to grief. For a family that had never quite been what any of us pretended it was. Sitting down now to hear, formally and permanently, exactly how far the pretending had gone. Henley touched my arm once gently. A small signal the clerk was calling the docket. I sat up straighter, folded my hands the way my grandfather used to fold his at that same kitchen table. I waited for the judge to begin. Judge Whitfield entered a moment later. Black robe, reading glasses on a thin gold chain. The kind of unhurried walk that told you she'd presided over 1,000 mornings like this one. None of them had ever rattled her. The bailiff called the room to order. Everyone stood. Everyone sat back down. For a strange few seconds, it felt almost ordinary, the way any courtroom procedure does, right up until the moment it stops being ordinary for the people it actually concerns. She opened a thin folder on the bench, glanced through it briefly, looked up over the top of her glasses at the room. This is a contested probate matter, she said. Estate of Earl Mercer. I've reviewed the filings from both parties in advance. I'll hear brief argument. But this court cares first about what the documentary record shows, not the emotional history between the parties, however difficult that history may be. I appreciated that hearing it. It was, in a strange way, exactly the register I'd been trying to hold myself in for 6 weeks. Not emotion, not accusation, just the record speaking for itself. Henley stood. The court finds, Judge Whitfield said, that the trust instrument executed by Earl Mercer was properly notarized, properly recorded prior to his death. It controls the disposition of the Deer Creek property, and the accounts referenced within it. The subsequent will, while validly executed, has no further estate to distribute as to those specific assets. They had already left the estate under the terms of the trust. This court formally recognizes Dana Marie Foley as trustee and sole beneficiary of those assets, effective as of the original recording date. I felt the room shift around that sentence, the way a field shifts after a long overdue rain. Not loud, not dramatic, just a settling. Everyone in that gallery quietly recalculating what they thought they knew. My mother did not cry. Not there, not in front of everyone. I want to give her that much credit. I understand now, better than before, how much composure can cost a person in a room full of witnesses. But I watched her hands, folded tightly in her lap. I watched the particular stillness of someone absorbing a loss too large to process in real time, in public, with a court reporter typing every second of it into a permanent record. Henley had one more thing to enter. This was the part I hadn't fully prepared myself for, even after weeks of knowing it was coming. He asked the court's permission to read a short personal letter into the record, not as evidence bearing on the trust's validity, which had already been settled, as context regarding the deceased's intent. Judge Whitfield allowed it. He read my grandfather's letter aloud, word for word, in that quiet courtroom, with my whole family and half a dozen curious neighbours listening. "You were never the backup. You were the only one who showed up." I heard my mother make a small sound at that line, not quite a sob, something smaller and more private than that. I didn't look over at her. I understood, in that moment, that some part of what she was losing had nothing to do with the farm or the money at all. The judge thanked Henley, noted the loan matter would proceed separately, with the bank's counsel and, potentially, the county attorney's office, given the fraud examiner's presence. She adjourned the hearing. The whole thing had taken less than 40 minutes. Walking out into the flat grey Iowa daylight, it felt like it had taken 11 years. I want to tell you what happened in the weeks after, because Henley had told me it would widen out slowly, and it did. Procedurally. Without a single dramatic phone call, the way most real consequences actually arrive. The bank called the loan within 10 days of the trust's formal recognition, exactly as Henley predicted. $312,000 due in full, unsecured, with no collateral left to attach it to. My parents didn't have that kind of money. Not close to it. Within a month, a lien was filed against the house on Summit Street itself, the one asset they still fully owned, to begin recovering what could be recovered. The bank's internal review of Grantham, the loan officer who'd approved the original application without verifying the title, ended in his termination 6 weeks later. A detail I only learned because Roy Denby mentioned it in passing at the grocery store. The way news travels through a town this size, whether you go looking for it or not. Whether the county attorney's office pursued anything further against my parents, I genuinely don't know. Henley told me plainly it wasn't something I needed to track. The trust had been settled. The rest belonged to institutions bigger than our family, moving at their own pace, for their own reasons. Cole's company folded within 2 months. Foley Fabrication Solutions filed for dissolution with the state, a filing Henley showed me only because I asked, not because it mattered to the trust. Cole moved to Cedar Rapids not long after. To stay with a friend from college, my father told me once, looking for work in a market bigger than a town that already knew too much about him. My mother and father sold the house on Summit Street 11 weeks after the hearing, using the proceeds to settle most of what remained on the loan after the bank's collection efforts. They moved into a smaller rental on the east side of town, the kind of 2-bedroom place that had never, in all my years in Marshalltown, been anyone's idea of where they'd end up at 60. I didn't gloat over any of it. I want you to believe that, because it's true. What I felt watching each piece land was closer to a held breath finally released than to satisfaction. 11 years of invisible labour had built a structure that was never going to stand forever on my back alone. When I finally set it down, it fell exactly where gravity had always intended. On the people who'd been standing underneath it the whole time, confident it would hold. I want to tell you what I did that same afternoon, because it mattered more to me quietly than anything that happened in that courtroom. It's the part of this story that belongs to me alone. Not to Henley, not to a judge, not to anyone else. I drove home, made a pot of coffee I actually drank instead of letting go cold. I sat down at my kitchen table with my laptop. I logged into the account I'd used for 11 years, the one that wired my parents' mortgage payment on the first of every month. I looked at the standing transfer, $1,140, scheduled to go out again in 6 days. It had gone out on the first of the month for 132 consecutive months, never once missed. I cancelled it. I cancelled the car payment authorization for my mother's Buick. $211 a month, still running on an account I'd set up years earlier and simply never thought to close. I cancelled the standing authorization on my father's blood pressure copay. $42 a month, routed automatically to the pharmacy on Main Street, since a year I could no longer precisely remember. I didn't do this out of spite. I want to be very clear about that. It would be easy to hear it that way. It isn't what it was. A trust had just been formally recognised in open court. It named me trustee and sole beneficiary of 310 acres. And every dollar attached to it, There was no longer any version of reality where I was still, quietly, propping up two people. Two people who'd just spent a morning arguing I didn't deserve any of it. I stopped holding it up. That's all it was, I simply stopped. I sat there afterward a long time, watching the screen confirm each cancellation, one after another. 11 years of small, invisible transactions, closing out in about 4 minutes. I felt something I hadn't expected. Not triumph. Not grief. Something closer to quiet. The particular quiet of a column of numbers, finally, completely, coming to zero. The weeks after the hearing widened out slowly, the way Henley told me they would, procedurally, without a single dramatic phone call. The way most real consequences actually arrive. The bank called the loan within 10 days of the trust's formal recognition, exactly as Henley predicted. $312,000, due in full, unsecured, with no collateral left to attach it to. My parents didn't have that kind of money, not close to it. Within a month, a lien was filed against the house on Summit Street itself, the one asset they still fully owned, to begin recovering what could be recovered. The bank's internal review of Grantham ended in his termination 6 weeks later. A detail I only learned because Roy Denby mentioned it in passing at the grocery store. That's how news travels through a town this size, whether you go looking for it or not. Whether the county attorney's office pursued anything further, I genuinely don't know. Henley told me plainly it wasn't something I needed to track. The trust had been settled. The rest belonged to institutions bigger than our family, moving at their own pace, for their own reasons. Cole's company folded within 2 months. Foley Fabrication Solutions filed for dissolution with the state, a filing Henley showed me only because I asked. Cole moved to Cedar Rapids not long after. To stay with a friend from college, my father told me once, looking for work in a market bigger than a town that already knew too much about him. My mother and father sold the house on Summit Street 11 weeks after the hearing. They used the proceeds to settle most of what remained on the loan after the bank's collection efforts. They moved into a smaller rental on the east side of town, the kind of 2-bedroom place that had never, in all my years in Marshalltown, been anyone's idea of where they'd end up at 60. I didn't gloat over any of it. I want you to believe that, because it's true. What I felt, watching each piece land, was closer to a held breath finally released than to satisfaction. 11 years of invisible labour had built a structure that was never going to stand forever on my back alone. When I finally set it down, it fell exactly where gravity had always intended. On the people who'd been standing underneath it the whole time, confident it would hold. I moved out to the Deer Creek farmhouse myself, about 4 months after the hearing, once probate had fully closed. The deed was recorded clean at the county. My name on it. No liens, no questions, no shadow of a loan hanging over a single acre. The place needed work. 11 years of a grieving old man living alone had left the porch railing loose in 3 places. The north gutter hung by a single bracket. I want to tell you honestly, fixing those things myself, one Saturday at a time, felt like the first purely joyful labour I'd done in longer than I could remember. For the first time in 11 years, every dollar I spent went towards something legally, permanently mine. I hired a contractor out of Marshalltown to redo the roof. $6,400. Notice, if you've been keeping track, that's nearly the exact figure I once paid to fix my parents' roof, after a hailstorm they hadn't bothered to insure against. I paid this one gladly. It felt entirely different. Writing that check, though the number was almost the same. I saw my father twice in the 6 months after the hearing. Both times at his own request. Both times over coffee at the diner on Main Street. Not at either of our homes. A kind of neutral ground he seemed to need. He didn't ask me for anything either time, which surprised me. He mostly wanted to talk about my grandfather, stories from before I was born. The year Earl Mercer built the porch himself with a borrowed circular saw. He swore the whole time, according to my father, in a way that would have scandalised the church directory. He always thought you were the one who'd hold it together, my father told me the second time. He was stirring sugar into coffee he didn't usually take sugar in. I used to think that meant he underestimated Cole and your mother. I don't think that anymore. I asked him carefully how he was doing, genuinely wanting to know. He told me the rental on the east side was smaller than he'd like, but he'd started part-time inventory work at the hardware store, 2 mornings a week. First job he'd held in almost 9 years. It felt, he said, strange and a little bit good. to be useful again in a way nobody was managing for him. I did not offer him money. I want to be honest about that. It would have been easy. I had a trust in my name and $61,000 I hadn't fully spent. I could have simply written a check and called it forgiveness. I didn't. Henley told me once that was the right instinct. Real repair, if it happened between my father and me, needed to be built the slow way. One honest transaction at a time. Not bought all at once. What I did instead was invite him out to the farmhouse the following month to help me reset the porch railing his own father had built 50 years earlier. He came. We worked in silence most of the afternoon. Near the end, tightening the last bracket, he told me something. It was the first time in longer than he could remember that he'd felt like he was doing something worth doing with his hands. I told him he could come back any time there was work to be done. He has 3 times since. Each time a little less awkward, a little more like something that might, slowly, become an actual relationship instead of a debt neither of us knows how to discuss. The last time he came out, in early fall, he brought a small toolbox of his own. An old one, dug out of a storage unit he'd almost forgotten he still paid for. He didn't say much about it. Just set it down by the porch steps and got to work. But I noticed the initials scratched into the lid. His own father's from a lifetime before either of us existed. Some inheritances arrive quietly, in a toolbox nobody thought to mention, long after the loud ones have already been settled in a courtroom. My mother has not reached out, not once since the hearing. I don't know if she ever will. Henley told me once that some people can survive losing an argument, but never quite survive being wrong in front of witnesses. I think more than anything else in this story, that's what actually broke between my mother and me. Not the farm, not the money. She said a cruel and dismissive thing to my face, in a room full of people, confident she'd never have to answer for it. And then she had to answer for it anyway, in a courtroom, on the public record, with her own father's letter read aloud over the top of it. I don't carry anger about that the way I thought I would. Mostly I carry a kind of settled clarity. The same clarity you feel at the end of a long reconciliation, when every column finally matches and there's nothing left to chase down. I loved my mother for 33 years the way you love the sky, without asking much of it in return. I understand now that some skies simply don't clear, no matter how long you wait under them. Eventually you have to build your own roof and stop checking the forecast. Cole and I have spoken exactly once since Cedar Rapids. A short stiff phone call a few weeks after his company's dissolution. Mostly, I think, to ask whether I'd say anything to a prospective employer who'd called Henley's office looking for a reference on his character. I told him I had nothing bad to say and nothing good to add, which was true. He thanked me, quietly, in a voice that sounded, for the first time in his life, like it wasn't performing for anyone. I've thought a great deal, these past months, about what I actually wanted out of any of this. I keep landing on the same answer. It was never the farm. I would have signed that acknowledgement form at the will reading, driven home, gone right on quietly wiring $1,140 a month for the rest of my working life. If my grandfather hadn't already decided, over a year before he died, that I deserved better than being someone's backup plan. What I wanted, once I knew the truth, was simply to be heard telling it, in the same room where I'd once been dismissed. Without having to raise my voice to be believed, I want to close with the last thing I haven't told you yet, before I let this rest. What I did with the $61,000 my grandfather quietly set aside for me. The one I found tucked behind the last page of his ledger. Alongside the deed, the loan application, and the index card that told me to count carefully. I used $11,000 of it this past spring to pay off the balance on a young couple's farm equipment loan 2 towns over, people I'd never met before that winter. Their tractor had thrown a rod in the middle of planting season, no way to cover the repair without missing the window entirely. I found them through the co-op, the way I find most things worth knowing about in this county. I wired the money the same way I used to wire my parents' mortgage, quietly on the first of the month. No note attached beyond one line, pay it forward when you are able. I didn't do it to be thanked, and I wasn't. That's what a hidden asset is actually for in the end. Not hoarding, not revenge. Just quietly keeping something upright for someone who needs it held up a little while. The way my grandfather once held me up, without ever making it feel like a debt. I still work at the co-op, 3 days a week now instead of 5. The farm takes more hours than I expected. I've started taking on bookkeeping work of my own. On the side, mostly for small operations around the county that can't afford a full-time accountant. Patricia Voss called me in the fall to ask if I'd consider contract work, reviewing smaller cooperative accounts across 3 counties. I said yes, being told plainly by someone with no reason to flatter me that my work has value. That turns out to be a feeling I could stand to have more of in my life. I want to tell you about a particular evening, maybe 2 months after I moved into the farmhouse. It's the moment I understood, fully, that something in me had actually changed. Not just my circumstances. I was going through a box of my grandfather's old papers in the front room, the kind of sorting you put off for months after someone dies because you're never quite ready for what you might find. I came across a photograph I'd never seen before. My grandfather standing on that same porch, decades earlier, younger than I ever knew him. Beside him, a woman I recognised after a moment as my grandmother. She died when I was 6, a memory I barely hold on to anymore, except in fragments. On the back, in handwriting I now knew as well as my own, he'd written a single line. Built this for Ruth so she'd always have somewhere steady to stand. I sat with that photograph a long time, on the same porch he'd built, in the last of the evening light. I thought about the word steady, the same word Henley had used quoting my grandfather, about what made a person trustworthy, someone who keeps doing the right thing long after they've stopped expecting anyone to notice. My grandfather had spent his whole life building steady things for people he loved, a porch for his wife, a trust for his granddaughter. Quietly, without ever once making a show of it. The greatest inheritance he actually left me wasn't the acreage or the accounts at all. It was the instinct itself, the reflex to keep something upright for someone else, without needing applause for it. I think about the shoebox often still. I kept it, even after everything. It sits now on a shelf in the farmhouse's front room, next to my grandfather's leather ledger. Both of them holding 11 years of proof. Quiet, patient record-keeping outlasts loud cruelty every single time, even when it takes over a decade to matter to anyone but you. I sold nothing off that farm in the end. I kept all 310 acres. I leased most of the tillable ground to a neighbouring operation, the way my grandfather had for years. I used the income to slowly restore the place, along with what remained of the $61,000. Rather than flip it or cash it out, I understood somewhere in those first few weeks that this had never really been about the money for me either. It was about a man who saw me clearly when almost no one else in my family ever had. A man who built, with the last careful years of his life, a way to make sure that clarity outlived him. I don't know if that makes me lucky or simply careful. Maybe there's no real difference between the two, in the end. I think most nights now about how strange 11 years is. That's how long I spent proving something to people who were never actually keeping score the way I was. I don't regret those years. Not entirely. They made me exactly careful enough to notice a brass key in a ceramic dish. Careful enough to catch a single, underlined line in an old man's ledger. Someone less patient might have missed both, but I don't romanticize them either. I paid a mortgage that wasn't mine for over a decade because nobody else in that house was willing to. The only person who ever once acknowledged what that cost me is buried now in the Marshalltown Cemetery, under a plain granite stone he picked out himself years in advance, the same way he picked out everything else in his life, carefully, without asking anyone's permission first. Patricia Voss came out to the farmhouse a few weeks ago to look over the new bookkeeping contracts I'd started taking on. She stood on the porch a minute before she left, looking out at the fields the way most visitors seem to. She asked me, almost offhand, whether I ever thought about what would have happened if I hadn't found that key, if I'd simply let the will stand the way my mother wanted, if I'd kept quietly wiring money for another 11 years, without ever knowing what was waiting in a bank vault 2 blocks off Main Street. I told her the truth. I nearly did miss it more than once. I almost didn't check the ceramic dish on the windowsill that first terrible night, the night I found him. Grief makes you move through a house looking only for the things you already know you're looking for. The insurance papers, the funeral home's number. Not a small unlabelled key mixed in with paper clips and a folded church bulletin. I almost let the second envelope inside the ledger's binding go unnoticed too. I'd already found what I thought was the whole story. On the pages before it, it would have been easy, reasonable even, to close the book there and call the search finished. Count carefully. There's always one more page than they think there is. My grandfather knew, better than I did at the time, how easy it is to stop looking one page too soon. I think that's the real reason he chose me in the end. Not simply because I paid the bills for 11 years, though I know that mattered to him too. He chose me because he'd watched me, my whole life, refuse to stop at the first plausible answer, whether it was a checkbook that didn't balance, or a family that insisted, year after year, that everything was fine. He knew I'd keep turning pages long after anyone reasonable would have stopped. He built a trust that could only be found by someone willing to do exactly that. Cole called again last month, the second time since Cedar Rapids, this time to tell me he'd found steady work at a manufacturing plant outside the city, an ordinary job on an assembly line, nothing like the company he used to describe so confidently at our parents' dinner table. He sounded different on the phone, quieter, less inclined to fill silence with a joke that wasn't really a joke. He asked near the end of the call whether I thought Grandpa would have been disappointed in him. I told him honestly I didn't know. It wasn't my place to speak for a dead man's disappointment. But starting over honestly at 36 struck me as a harder and more respectable thing than most people ever attempt. He should probably measure himself against that, instead of a company that was never real to begin with. He didn't say much after that. Just thanked me. We haven't spoken since, though I don't think the door between us is closed the way it once was with my mother. I've come to believe this whole story was never really about a farmhouse, or a savings account, or even 11 years of bills. Not at its core. It was about the particular, quiet violence of being treated as useful, without ever being treated as worthy, and about a specific relief. Discovering, late and almost by accident, that one person in your life had seen the difference all along, and had spent his final years quietly making sure the rest of the world would eventually see it too. Walter Henley drove out to the farmhouse one Thursday afternoon, in late summer, unannounced, which surprised me. He'd always called ahead before. We sat together on the porch. After a while, he told me he was retiring at the end of the year. 41 years doing this work. My grandfather had been one of his first clients, back when Henley was barely out of law school. I wanted to see, with my own eyes, that it landed somewhere solid, he told me, looking out over the fields. 41 years, Dana. I can count on one hand the times a case ended the way the person who built it actually hoped it would. Your grandfather built this one slowly and carefully, trusting the right person would eventually find every piece in order. I don't think he could have hoped for a better outcome than this. Watching you sit here in this house with the whole thing finally settled. I didn't have much of an answer beyond thank you. It felt small against the size of what he was telling me. But some gratitude doesn't need more words than that. We sat together a while longer, watching the light change, before he drove back into town. Even now I keep the brass key on a small nail by the kitchen door, not because I still need it for anything. Box 118 is empty, its contents long since moved into a fireproof safe in the farmhouse's front room. It feels wrong somehow to put away the object that led me to everything else. It hangs there the way it once sat in a ceramic dish on my grandfather's windowsill. Unremarkable. Waiting. Holding more weight than its size would ever suggest, to anyone who didn't already know its story. Some mornings before the co-op work or the ledger reviews, I sit at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee. I let it go cold the way he always did. Not out of habit exactly. More like a small private ritual, a way of keeping one part of him present in a house that is now, legally and completely, mine. There's a particular hour, most evenings, right before the sun drops behind the tree line. The whole farmhouse goes gold for about 10 minutes. The same gold, I imagine it went every evening for 50 years before I ever set foot in it. Whether anyone was watching or not, I've started sitting on the porch for that hour, most nights. The ledger closed on the table beside me, the brass key catching the last of the light on its little nail by the door. I think sometimes about my grandfather sitting on this same porch decades ago, watching this same light fade over this same pasture. Long before any of us knew what he was quietly building underneath it all, he never once made it a performance. He simply did the steady thing year after year and waited for the right person to notice. Tonight, like most nights, I sat there until the gold gave way to blue. Then I went inside and hung the key back on its nail.